These weren't just spiritual leaders. Some were power-hungry nobles, military strategists, or, in a few cases, dramatic soap opera characters who happened to wear a mitre. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When people think of the papacy, they often imagine a solemn, white-robed figure waving serenely from a balcony, perhaps offering blessings, peace, and a few firm reminders about morality. What they don't picture is a teenage nobleman gambling away church funds, or a pope with so many enemies he had to build a moat around his palace. But welcome to the Middle Ages, where the papal throne wasn't just a seat of holiness. It was the most contested power chair in Europe, second only to whichever throne was currently being fought over in France. In theory, the Pope was the vicar of Christ, the spiritual father of all Christians, a man of prayer, humility, and self-sacrifice. In practice, the papacy often functioned like an elite political prize passed between ambitious families like a really fancy potato, one that came with armies, land, and enough gold to start a small kingdom, or at least a scandal or two. The chair of St. Peter wasn't just sacred, it was strategic. Whoever sat in it had the power to crown emperors, excommunicate kings, and decide which side of a war God was allegedly on. That's a lot of pressure for one man. It's also a lot of temptation, especially if that man was elected with the help of bribes, distant cousins, and one suspiciously enthusiastic cardinal. Popes weren't always theologians or saints. Many were noble sons with no military potential, conveniently pushed into the church like a backup career option. Think, you're not good with a sword, Benedict, but you're great at Latin. How about controlling all of Western Christendom? And once in power, some popes ruled like monarchs, waging wars, collecting taxes, and, in certain cases, living like Renaissance playboys with excellent robes. The lines between spiritual authority and political strategy got blurrier by the century. By the time we hit the 10th and 11th centuries, papal elections involved enough intrigue to make a Netflix drama look restrained. This is the world we're stepping into. Not one of quiet reflection, but of ambition, corruption, and the occasional courtroom trial held against a corpse. Let's be clear, appointing an 18-year-old as supreme head of the Catholic Church was probably not the best idea. But in the year 955, Rome did exactly that when Octavianus, son of a powerful Roman noble, became Pope John XII, a name he adopted presumably to sound more papal and less like someone who still needed help tying his sandals. He wasn't chosen for his piety or deep theological insight. He was chosen because his family owned enough influence in Rome to make the Vatican look like a family-run franchise. And once he got the job, young John treated the papacy not as a spiritual office, but as a sort of personal amusement park with keys to the treasure vault. His behaviour quickly earned him a reputation that was less father of Christendom and more bored Roman noble with too much power. He allegedly gambled in the Lateran Palace, drank excessively, toasted to pagan gods during feasts, and transformed the papal residence into something halfway between a pleasure palace and a very mismanaged hotel. Contemporaries accused him of turning the Lateran into a brothel. He reportedly ordained a deacon in a stable. He held wild banquets where the line between sin and sacrament got blurry, if it existed at all. One chronicler accused him of living like a satyr, which, in medieval diplomatic language, translates roughly to, "This man makes Caligula look reserved." Worse still, John had no qualms about mixing politics with personal vendettas. He once had someone's eyes gouged out. Another man's tongue was allegedly cut out. Then he raised an army, then lost it, then begged the German Emperor Otto I to come help, and then betrayed him the second his back was turned. It all ended, fittingly, in scandal. In 964, Pope John XII reportedly died of a stroke while in bed with a married woman. Some say he was struck down for his sins. Others think the woman's husband may have done the striking. If Pope John XII's job description included embarrass the church thoroughly and often, then it's safe to say he overperformed. His behaviour wasn't just questionable by papal standards, it was questionable by Roman tavern standards, and that's saying something. Let's start with the gambling. Medieval chroniclers were scandalised to find out that the Pope, the supposed vicar of Christ, enjoyed dice games so much that he allegedly played them during papal audiences. Nothing says, "Blessed are the meek," like rolling a natural 12 while collecting tithes. John was accused of invoking pagan gods while gambling, which, theologically speaking, is somewhere between deeply problematic and Old Testament smiting territory. But John wasn't finished. Reports suggest he kept a rotating cast of mistresses, some of whom were married, some of whom were nuns, and at least one of whom was likely just trying to deliver bread and left with regrets and rosaries. The Lateran Palace, once a centre of clerical learning, became something closer to a Roman bachelor pad with stained glass windows. Even his treatment of the church's most sacred traditions felt like parody. He was said to bless men with his left hand, which in medieval symbolism was basically the spiritual equivalent of flipping the bird. He offered church lands in exchange for favours, ordained a deacon in a horse stable, and reportedly toasted Satan during a drunken feast. To be fair, it's unclear whether this was a genuine theological error or just extremely bad party etiquette. The Roman nobles were furious. The German Emperor Otto I was even more furious, especially after John swore loyalty to him, then immediately turned around and plotted against him. Eventually Otto marched into Rome and deposed the young pope, installing a replacement who was, at the very least, sober. But John came back like a medieval soap opera villain, retaking the papal throne through a combination of bribery, threats, and good old-fashioned chaos. If you thought one scandalous pope was enough, think again. Because along comes Pope Benedict IX, a man so controversial, he didn't just serve one papal term, he served 3. Not out of devotion, not even by popular demand. No, Benedict came back multiple times the way a bad landlord keeps reclaiming the lease. He first became pope in 1032 at about age 20, though estimates vary, which, to be clear, is still far too young to lead a global religion, especially when your hobbies include orgies, bribes, and wielding church authority like a child with a flamethrower. Benedict's first reign was filled with whispers of immorality so intense, chroniclers began running out of synonyms for disgraceful. One even wrote that his behaviour was feasting on the sins of the flesh, which is medieval shorthand for, "Please, someone stop this man." Accusations ranged from simony and extortion to the charming detail that he brought wild animals into the papal palace. Whether that was metaphorical or literal is unclear, which somehow makes it worse. Eventually, even his allies were horrified. In 1044, an uprising forced Benedict out, but he returned, obviously, because what's a little revolution among friends? He reclaimed the throne, and then, in a twist even Machiavelli might call excessive, sold the papacy to his godfather. Yes, he literally sold it, in exchange for gold and a comfortable retirement. His godfather, conveniently named Pope Gregory VI, took over. The church naturally panicked. So now there were 2 living popes, both technically legitimate, and Benedict, ever the opportunist, changed his mind. He came back. In what would become his 3rd papal term, Benedict barged back into Rome in 1047 and reasserted his claim. His comeback was less about theology and more about real estate. He wanted control, again. The church at this point was so tired it practically sighed in Latin. Eventually Emperor Henry III intervened and installed Pope Clement II, and Benedict was permanently out, excommunicated, banished, forgotten. Well, almost forgotten, because Benedict remains the only man in history to sell the papacy like a used carriage, and in doing so, he proved that sometimes The most scandalous sin isn't lust or greed, but treating the highest holy office like a summer job. If you thought medieval popes limited their drama to politics and power, let's now enter the realm of romantic entanglements, jealousy, and family dysfunction. The part of papal history that reads more like a rejected script from The Young and the Restless, Vatican edition. Let's revisit Benedict IX, who, by this point in the saga, had already claimed the papacy more times than most people claim free coffee punch cards. When he wasn't busy being ousted or reinstalled, he was falling in and out of love with such chaotic intensity that even medieval chroniclers struggled to keep up. According to one account, Benedict decided to sell the papacy to his godfather not out of remorse or political pressure, but because, and this is real, he wanted to get married. Apparently there was a woman he fancied. He believed stepping down from being pope would impress her. A romantic gesture, yes. A theologically horrifying one? Also yes. It didn't work. The woman declined his offer. Likely because her dowry didn't include lifelong public shame or awkward family dinners where your husband used to be pope. Benedict, humiliated and still single, then tried to take the papacy back, not for love anymore, but out of sheer papal spite. This wasn't an isolated case of romance interfering with Rome. Pope Sergius III, earlier in the 10th century, allegedly had a long-standing affair with Marozia, a powerful Roman noblewoman. They may have had a child together, who would later become Pope John XI. Yes, that's right. We had a pope who was the son of a pope, a concept which, theologically, breaks more rules than a medieval cook during Lent. The papacy during this era was so dominated by noble families marrying, feuding and scheming for power that historians dubbed it the pornocracy. Literally, rule of the harlots. Harsh? Maybe. But when family alliances involve cardinals, concubines and cousins all playing musical thrones with holy orders, it's hard to argue. If you thought papal scandals were limited to the living, allow me to introduce you to one of the most bizarre episodes in church history, a moment so surreal it feels like a Monty Python sketch directed by Dante himself. In the year 897, Pope Stephen VI had a bone to pick with his predecessor, Pope Formosus. The problem? Formosus was dead, and had been for nearly a year. But that minor detail didn't stop Stephen from launching what historians now call the Cadaver Synod, also known as the time a pope literally put another pope's corpse on trial. Here's how it went down. Stephen had Formosus's rotting body dug up from its grave, dressed in full papal regalia, and propped upright on a throne inside the Lateran Basilica. And then, because medieval drama has no breaks, Stephen appointed a deacon to act as defence counsel for the corpse. Yes, someone had to speak on behalf of a rotting skeleton while keeping a straight face. The charges? Illegally ascending to the papacy, violating canon law, and, essentially, being pope, while someone else thought he shouldn't be. Formosus, understandably quiet throughout, was found guilty. His papal garments were torn off, 3 of his blessing fingers were cut off, and his body was thrown into the Tiber River like a very unholy log. Shockingly, not everyone thought this was a reasonable use of church resources. The spectacle caused widespread outrage, even by 9th century standards. Rome, already accustomed to ecclesiastical nonsense, collectively gasped. Riots broke out. Bishops were appalled. The general public, who had presumably seen their fair share of weird, finally drew the line at corpse prosecution. Stephen's papacy didn't last long after that. He was imprisoned and strangled in his cell, likely by someone who thought justice should involve fewer cadavers and more common sense. The Cadaver Synod remains one of the most infamous moments in papal history, not because it changed doctrine, but because it's a reminder that absolute power, unchecked grief, and poor impulse control can lead to courtroom dramas that no one, not even the deceased, can walk away from. After the Cadaver Synod, there was a general consensus in Rome that things had gotten a bit excessive. You can push people pretty far. Nepotism, bribes, even the occasional holy war. But dragging a decomposed pope into court and sawing off his fingers? That was apparently where medieval society drew the line. Pope Stephen VI, fresh off his post-trial corpse disposal, expected applause. What he got instead was a papal version of the cold shoulder. Bishops whispered. Cardinals looked away. Roman citizens muttered into their wine. The clergy, who'd gamely tolerated decades of questionable behaviour, now had to explain why the papacy resembled a haunted puppet show. Within months, Rome was in open revolt, and not a polite parchment-signing sort of protest, more of the storm the Lateran Palace with torches and pitchforks variety. The message was clear. We'll tolerate a lot from a pope, but we'd like our dead to stay buried, thank you very much. Stephen was quickly deposed. Technically, he was arrested for political reasons, which is medieval speak for, everyone's embarrassed, and you need to go now. He was thrown into prison, and shortly thereafter strangled by unknown hands, though let's be honest, there were probably several volunteers. His successor, Pope Romanus, did what most new managers do after a disastrous predecessor, reversed nearly everything. He nullified the cadaver synod, tried to fish for Moses' remains out of the Tiber, they eventually found him, and reburied the poor man with full honours, presumably this time under lock and key. Still, the damage was done. The synod had revealed just how far papal politics had drifted from spirituality and into the realm of vindictive theatrics. Faithful Christians, even the more gullible ones, had to ask, is the man in charge of our salvation emotionally stable enough to not yell at corpses? By the early 14th century, the papacy was in full retreat, from Rome that is. And not for a spiritual sabbatical or architectural renovation, but because the French crown essentially kidnapped the Pope. Politely, of course. In 1309, Pope Clement V moved the papal court from chaotic, riot-prone Rome to the much calmer, wine-soaked town of Avignon, nestled snugly in the south of France. Thus began the period known as the Avignon Papacy, or as Rome might have called it, that time our Pope ghosted us for 70 years. Now, officially, the move was for safety. Rome, they said, was too dangerous, which it absolutely was. Murder, factionalism, and general Renaissance street drama were rampant. But Avignon just so happened to be under heavy French influence, and somehow every pope elected during this period just so happened to be French. What a miraculous coincidence. The Avignon court quickly developed a reputation, not for piety, but for luxury. The papal palace was more Versailles than Vatican. Banquets, silks, tapestries, personal chefs, and entire wine cellars that could put a monastery under the table. One pope reportedly spent more on spices than on alms for the poor. You could argue he was seasoning souls. Diplomatic letters and complaints poured in from all corners of Christendom. Cardinals muttered about corruption. Local Italian nobles fumed. Pilgrims stared at the empty windows of St. Peter's Basilica and muttered, "Is anyone home?" But the Avignon popes were not in a hurry. Why return to Rome when Avignon had better plumbing, fewer mobs, and actual cheese courses? Still, cracks started to form. The church's image took a hit. Critics called it the Babylonian captivity of the church, comparing the papacy's absence to Israel's exile. Harsh? Yes. But when your holiest office is operating out of a French wine region, people notice. Eventually, pressure mounted. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome, but not before nearly 7 decades of absenteeism had transformed the papacy from a Roman institution to a cross-border circus. It was meant to be a safe haven. Instead, it turned into a gilded exile, with excellent catering. And just when things seemed to settle, the Church decided to up the chaos by electing 2 popes. If one pope can cause a scandal, and 2 popes can spark confusion, then 3 popes all claiming to be the real pope is officially what medieval historians refer to as a theological dumpster fire. After the Avignon papacy finally ended in 1377 and the papacy returned to Rome, the Church breathed a collective sigh of relief for about 5 minutes. Then Pope Gregory XI died. The Roman mob demanded an Italian pope, very loudly, with torches. So the cardinals, many of them French, quickly elected Urban VI, an Italian. Problem solved? Not exactly. Urban turned out to be, let's say, difficult. He scolded the cardinals, refused to compromise, and accused people of plotting against him, which, in fairness, they eventually did. The cardinals, regretting their decision almost immediately, declared the election invalid, citing mob pressure, and probably heartburn, and elected Clement VII instead. He set up shop back in Avignon. Thus began the Western Schism, where two popes claimed legitimacy, each excommunicating the other with great passion and zero self-awareness. It was like a very expensive divorce, but instead of splitting property, they split Christendom. Kings had to pick sides. France, Scotland and Spain backed Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy stuck with Rome. Bishops were confused, parishioners were baffled, and salvation itself began to feel like a matter of geographic convenience. This two-pope system went on for decades, but naturally, the Church found a way to make things worse. In 1409, a council in Pisa tried to resolve the issue by firing both popes and electing a third, Alexander V. But neither of the original popes stepped down. So now, for a brief and glorious moment in history, the Catholic Church had three popes. Each claimed to be the only legitimate one. Each excommunicated the others, and all three refused to share the Holy Hat. Finally, in 1417, the Council of Constance got serious. They deposed or pressured all three claimants to step aside and elected Pope Martin V, who presumably agreed not to start any more schisms for at least a week. If you thought the papacy couldn't possibly outdo corpse trials, papal sales, and spiritual three-ways, allow me to introduce Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI, a man whose time in office was so decadent, even Renaissance Italy blushed. Elected in 1492, yes, the same year Columbus got his sea legs, Rodrigo was less of a spiritual shepherd and more of a political apex predator. His rise to the papacy involved the usual prayers and incense, plus a record-breaking number of bribes. Cardinals allegedly received palaces, gold, and possibly foot massages in exchange for their votes. It was less an election and more an ecclesiastical Black Friday. Once installed as Pope, Alexander treated the Vatican like a combination of mafia headquarters and family estate. And I do mean family. He openly acknowledged multiple children, most famously Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, which, for a pope sworn to celibacy, was a bold move. Rather than hiding his illegitimate kids, he promoted them. Cesare got military campaigns. Lucrezia got politically strategic marriages. Nepotism? Please. Borgias invented the deluxe version. Alexander was also a master of double dealing. He'd promise French kings one thing, then immediately write to the Spanish monarch offering the opposite, with his signature, wax seal, and likely a complimentary bottle of papal wine. The church treasury was used like a personal bank account, financing wars, feasts, and renovations that suspiciously benefited the Borgia family holdings. The papal court under Alexander was infamous. Lavish banquets, masked balls, and rumours of orgies hosted in the Apostolic Palace became so frequent that some contemporaries suspected he confused holy orders with party planning. The term Borgia poison wasn't metaphorical. Enemies had a suspicious habit of dying after dinner. Despite the scandal, Alexander was incredibly effective, politically savvy, financially cunning, and well-connected. If the papacy was a business, he ran it like a CEO with a sword under the desk. He strengthened the Vatican's infrastructure, stabilized its finances by squeezing everyone, and expanded its influence across Europe. Holiness optional. He died in 1503, likely of malaria, or poison, or karma. Reports vary, but his legacy lives on as the ultimate reminder that in the Renaissance, even the Pope could be a warlord in robes, with a family crest, a side of scandal, and absolutely no shame. When your father is the Pope and also the most ambitious Borgia in history, your childhood is unlikely to involve lullabies and apple picking. For Lucrezia and Cesare Borgia, life was a constant whirl of alliances, daggers, weddings, and whispers, all under the elegant umbrella of the Vatican. Let's start with Cesare, the original Prince of the Church, turned actual Prince of Warfare. He was made a cardinal at the tender age of 18, because nothing says spiritual maturity like puberty. But red robes weren't really his colour. He preferred armour, and the occasional assassination. When his brother Giovanni died under mysterious circumstances, everyone looked at Cesare, including the Pope, who didn't seem overly upset. Shortly after, Cesare conveniently resigned from the cardinalate, which was not a thing people usually did, and switched careers from cleric to mercenary commander. Think, holy man to hitman in under a month. Funded by church coffers and backed by dear old dad, Cesare cut a swath through central Italy, conquering cities and eliminating rivals like a papal version of Grand Theft Auto, Renaissance edition. Now, Lucrezia. History has been both cruel and confused about her. Depending on the source, she was either a brilliant political pawn or a scheming poisoner with a flair for drama. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. She married 3 times, not out of romance, but because her father needed alliances. One husband was annulled, one mysteriously murdered. Cesare again. Big, maybe. And the third stuck around long enough for Lucrezia to become Duchess of Ferrara, and an actual patron of the arts. Rumours swirled. Incest, poison rings, secret lovers hidden under Vatican trapdoors. Historians now believe much of this was political smear. Enemies of the Borgias couldn't beat them with swords, so they tried slander instead. Still, when you're the daughter of a pope and your brother is building a private army, it's hard to stay scandal-free. Together, Lucrezia and Cesare became the Renaissance's most infamous siblings, brilliant, dangerous, and photogenic in frescoes. They blurred the line between royal family and organised crime. And through it all, Pope Alexander VI looked on proudly, like a father at a school play, where everyone is accidentally stabbed by Act 2. By the time Pope Julius II took office in 1503, the papacy had already been through every scandal imaginable, from corpse trials to nepotistic empires. Julius, however, had no patience for subtlety or sin. He didn't want to poison enemies. He wanted to crush them with armies. Born Giuliano della Rovere, Julius ascended the papal throne with one hand on his mitre and the other gripping a sword. He didn't bother pretending to be pious. He knew what he wanted: power, art, and really dramatic armour. He was called the Warrior Pope, not sarcastically, but literally. The man led troops into battle wearing full plate. Not spiritually, physically. Julius wasn't just playing war. He personally commanded campaigns to reclaim lost papal states. He swore like a mercenary, carried weapons, and once shouted down rebellious cardinals like a drill sergeant in Latin. When critics questioned whether a pope should really be riding into battle, Julius responded with the ecclesiastical equivalent of "hold my wine." Despite his warlike temperament, Julius also fancied himself a patron of the arts. And boy, did he deliver. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, a job that Michelangelo hated so much he wrote angry poems about it while painting upside down, day and night. Julius would check in by climbing the scaffolding and yelling at him for being slow. Artistic encouragement, Roman style. He also commissioned Raphael to decorate his private apartments, and Bramante to start rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica. Basically, if there was a Renaissance rock star available, Julius hired them, and probably yelled at them at least once. His papacy was violent, expensive, and loud, like a Renaissance action film produced by the Vatican. But in the end, Julius left behind a reformed and expanded church state, a re-energized Rome, and some of the most iconic art in human history. He died in 1513, not in battle, somewhat shockingly, but likely from natural causes. which, given his life, might have been his most anticlimactic decision. If Pope Julius II was the general who rode into battle with a sword, Pope Leo X was the aristocrat who waltzed into the Vatican wearing silk slippers and humming madrigals. Born Giovanni de' Medici, Leo didn't so much inherit the papacy as he glided into it, the first pope from the famous Medici family, and the spiritual equivalent of mixing haute couture with holy orders. He took office in 1513, famously declaring, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." Which is maybe not the most theologically sound mission statement, but certainly an honest one. Enjoy it he did. Leo turned the Vatican into the most exclusive salon in Europe. Banquets, theatre productions, exotic pets, and enough Renaissance decor to bankrupt a minor duchy. His pet elephant, Hanno, was so beloved that he had a custom marble house built for it, which says a lot about papal priorities at the time. Feeding the poor? Maybe tomorrow. Right now, Hanno needs another fruit platter. But Leo's indulgences, literal and figurative, went beyond exotic animals. Facing a massive hole in the Vatican's finances, thanks Julius, Leo approved an aggressive fundraising strategy, the widespread sale of indulgences. These were official church documents that, for the right price, promised to reduce time in purgatory. Sin now, pay later. It worked brilliantly. People lined up to buy spiritual discounts like they were at a Black Friday sale for souls. But not everyone was impressed. One particularly cranky monk in Germany, a certain Martin Luther, saw the whole affair and thought, absolutely not. Luther's famous 95 Theses, nailed to a church door in 1517, directly challenged Leo's indulgence policies, accusing the Pope of selling forgiveness like it was a meat market. Leo's response was leisurely. He called Luther a drunk German who will change his mind when sober. Spoiler, he didn't. Leo excommunicated Luther in 1521, but by then the Protestant Reformation had begun, and the Church's monopoly on salvation was slipping through its gilded fingers. Leo died the same year, reportedly from pneumonia, although some whispered it was from eating too much eel. Fitting, really, for a pope whose reign was indulgent in every possible sense. For over a millennium, much of the Western world believed that the human body was governed by four mysterious fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. This idea, known as the humour theory, became the foundation of ancient and medieval medicine. First proposed by Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE, and later expanded by Galen in the Roman Empire, the theory claimed that health was a delicate balance between these four substances. Illness? That meant one of your humours had gone rogue. Each humour was linked to a season, temperament, organ, and even personality type. Blood was warm and moist, linked to spring and a cheerful, sociable character. Yellow bile was hot and dry, associated with summer and anger. Black bile was cold and dry, linked to autumn and melancholy. Phlegm was cold and wet, tied to winter and a sluggish, calm disposition. So if someone was feeling overly weepy, ancient physicians wouldn't recommend therapy. They'd suggest dietary changes, or maybe a purgative to dry the excess black bile. Perhaps the most notorious treatment inspired by humour theory was bloodletting. Doctors and barbers alike would slice open a vein or apply leeches to drain excess blood, believing it would restore internal harmony. This practice became so widespread that some patients died not from illness, but from too much treatment. George Washington's death in 1799 is often attributed in part to aggressive bloodletting based on these same ideas. Despite its obvious flaws, humorism wasn't entirely foolish. It was an early attempt to create a systematic understanding of the body. It acknowledged that different symptoms could stem from internal imbalances rather than supernatural curses. It promoted close observation of the patient, what they ate, how they slept, the colour of their urine or spit. In some ways, it was the beginning of clinical reasoning, albeit wrapped in flawed biology. and it was stubborn. Humour theory survived into the Renaissance, influencing medicine, psychology, and even art. Treatments ranged from herbal remedies and dietary regimens to vomiting and enemas, all designed to realign the humours. If ancient doctors didn't know what was wrong with you, their first response was often chillingly simple: let the blood flow. Bloodletting became the go-to cure for everything from fevers to headaches, bad dreams to broken hearts. Rooted in the humour theory, it was believed that most illnesses resulted from an excess of blood, a humour associated with heat, vitality, and imbalances of the body and soul. The solution? Open a vein and let some of that pesky life juice escape. The practice existed across multiple civilizations. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates recommended it cautiously, while Galen turned it into an art form, arguing that blood needed to be removed from specific veins depending on the location of illness. Left temple pain? Open the right arm. Swollen liver? Go for the inner thigh. Precision in nonsense, but precision nonetheless. In medieval Europe, things escalated. Physicians used elaborate calendars, known as bleeding charts, to determine the best time to bleed based on moon phases and zodiac signs. Monks and barbers often did the bleeding, hence the classic red and white barber pole, symbolising blood and bandages. Yes, your friendly neighbourhood barber once doubled as a part-time surgeon. Bloodletting didn't always mean cutting open a vein. Sometimes leeches were used. These slimy little creatures could drink several times their body weight in blood and were considered a gentler, cleaner option. They were so popular that a medical leech shortage hit Europe in the 19th century. People hoarded them like gold. Did it work? Occasionally, by accident. Reducing blood volume can lower blood pressure, which may have helped in rare cases like high fevers or certain heart conditions. But more often, it weakened the patient, increased the risk of infection, and accelerated death. George Washington famously had nearly half of his blood removed during his final illness. He didn't recover. Yet despite its dangers, bloodletting persisted into the 19th century. Why? Because it felt proactive. It showed the healer was doing something, even if that something was harmful. And the ritual of it all, the instruments, the charts, the dramatic visuals, reinforced the illusion of medical control. Today, bloodletting is confined to a few rare conditions like hemochromatosis, but for centuries, it stood as one of medicine's most persistent myths. A vivid reminder that even well-meaning treatments, wrapped in tradition and theory, can do more harm than good. Before germs were even a whisper on the wind, ancient civilizations had their own explanation for disease: miasma, or bad air. For millennia, people believed that illness came not from bacteria or viruses, but from invisible noxious vapours rising from rotting matter, swamps, unburied corpses, or even immoral behaviour. If you smelled something foul, you were probably in danger. This theory wasn't a fringe idea. It was mainstream science from ancient Greece to Victorian London. The term miasma comes from the Greek miasma, meaning pollution or stain. According to thinkers like Hippocrates, breathing in corrupted air disrupted the balance of humours in the body, leading to disease. In Rome, poor neighbourhoods were seen as physically and morally unclean, and public health officials tried to combat disease by improving air circulation and controlling odours. The miasma theory persisted well into the Middle Ages and Renaissance. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, physicians wore bizarre beaked masks filled with herbs and spices. Those weren't fashion statements. They were early gas masks meant to purify the air. Cities burned incense in the streets, built massive bonfires, and relocated graveyards in hopes of banishing the deathly fumes. In ancient India and China, variations of miasma theory also flourished. In Sanskrit medical texts, bad wind was often cited as a source of disease. In Chinese medicine, qi, vital energy, could be corrupted by unclean air, leading to bodily disharmony. Though described differently, the core idea was the same. Polluted air meant sick bodies. Ironically, even though the miasma theory was scientifically wrong, It led to some public health victories. Urban sanitation projects in 19th century Europe, sewer systems, street cleaning, and freshwater infrastructure were driven by miasma theory. These efforts dramatically reduced disease, not because they cleaned the air, but because they removed the true culprits, bacteria in waste-contaminated water. The real death blow to the miasma model came in the mid-19th century with the work of scientists like John Snow and Louis Pasteur, who proved that cholera and other diseases were caused by microbes, not mist. But by then, miasma had left a lasting imprint on city planning, architecture, and medical thought. In the ancient world, the line between medicine and poison was razor thin, and often ignored entirely. Many treatments that were prescribed with the utmost seriousness would horrify a modern doctor. Chief among these was mercury, the glistening metal that fascinated physicians across cultures for centuries. To the ancients, it wasn't toxic, it was magical. In ancient China, mercury, called cinnabar when found in red crystalline form, was prized in Taoist alchemy. It was believed to promote immortality and spiritual enlightenment. Some emperors ingested pills made of mercury and arsenic to preserve youth. The result? Agonizing death by heavy metal poisoning. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, may have died from mercury elixirs intended to make him eternal. The Greeks and Romans weren't innocent either. Mercury was used as a laxative, a disinfectant, and even as a treatment for skin diseases. Later, in the Islamic Golden Age and medieval Europe, it became a favoured remedy for syphilis, applied topically, injected, or inhaled. Patients would drool uncontrollably, lose their teeth, and slowly go mad. But if the disease went into remission, the treatment was considered a success. And mercury was just the beginning. Take mandrake, a root shaped vaguely like a human figure. Across the Mediterranean, it was considered a powerful anesthetic and fertility aid, but also dangerously hallucinogenic. Harvesting it was said to be deadly unless done at night with elaborate rituals, and some legends claimed it screamed when uprooted. Still, Greek and Roman doctors ground it into sedatives, sometimes combining it with opium to knock out surgical patients. There was also lead, found in cosmetics, wine additives, and medical salves. Romans sweetened their wine with a syrup made by boiling grape juice in lead pots. Delicious, but slowly toxic. Chronic exposure caused everything from infertility to madness, but few made the connection. Even crocodile dung was fair game, used in Egyptian contraceptive formulas. That's right. Insert, hope for the best, and thank the gods. Why did these dangerous treatments persist? Because when medicine is based on symbolism, myth, and trial and error, anything is fair game. If something had a strong smell, a dramatic effect, or a strange shape, it was likely to be deemed powerful. And sometimes, by sheer accident, it worked. The ancient pharmacy was a cabinet of wonders and horrors. And while many of its remedies were lethal, they also reflect something deeply human, the willingness to try anything in the face of suffering, even if that meant drinking poison in search of a cure. When you think of ancient Egyptian medicine, one iconic image dominates: the mummy. But while embalming was primarily a ritual of religion and death, it also reveals a surprising amount about how the Egyptians understood the human body, and where they strayed, sometimes wildly, from anything we'd call science today. The Egyptians were obsessed with preservation. They believed that to achieve immortality, the body had to remain intact. This led to one of the most intricate embalming procedures in history, removing internal organs, drying the body with natron salts, and wrapping it meticulously in linen. The brain, removed through the nose with a hooked tool, then discarded. Ironically, one of the most complex organs was deemed useless. Yet their embalming skills required a functional knowledge of anatomy. They knew how to locate and remove the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. They understood the placement of muscles, bones, and vessels. In many ways, the embalmers were the closest thing ancient Egypt had to surgeons, practitioners who learned by taking the body apart. That said, their understanding of function lagged far behind their knowledge of form. They believed the heart was the centre of thought, memory, and emotion. Hence, why it was left in place or preserved separately. The brain? It was nothing more than filler. They thought disease came from blockages in bodily channels, often caused by evil spirits or unclean food. Remedies included herbal treatments, prayers, and spells, medicine and magic interwoven. Embalming also influenced Egyptian medical practice in another peculiar way. Mummified remains became ingredients. In Greco-Roman times, ground mummy powder, called mumia, was sold as a medicine. People believed consuming it could cure anything from headaches to internal bleeding. It didn't. It just meant people were swallowing embalmed human remains mixed with resin and linen. Despite the mystical framing, Egypt also had medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus, listing hundreds of remedies for wounds, digestive issues, and reproductive health. Some were surprisingly effective, involving honey, a natural antibacterial, mouldy bread, hello penicillin precursor, and castor oil. Others involved crocodile dung, amulets, or invoking gods. In the medieval Islamic world, one man stood at the crossroads of myth and medicine, Avicenna, also known as Ibn Sina. Born in 980 CE in present-day Uzbekistan, Avicenna became a towering figure in both philosophy and science. His most enduring work, the Canon of Medicine, was a sprawling medical encyclopedia that dominated Islamic and European medicine for centuries. Avicenna inherited the legacy of Greek thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, but he didn't just copy their ideas. He refined, challenged, and organized them into a more coherent system. The canon was structured like a master guidebook. Definitions of disease, anatomy, pharmacology, diagnostics, and treatments. It spanned everything from bladder stones to melancholia to rabies. But even Avicenna, brilliant as he was still shackled to the humour theory. He elaborated on the four humours and even assigned them to personalities and organs. Yet his genius lay in how systematically he applied these ideas. He emphasised observation, experimentation, and logical reasoning. A huge step forward in medical methodology, even if his biology was flawed. One of his greatest contributions was in pharmacology. Avicenna catalogued hundreds of drugs, categorized their effects, and insisted on testing them in controlled conditions. He warned against over-medicating and emphasized the importance of diet and environment in healing. This holistic approach, treating not just symptoms but lifestyle, feels surprisingly modern. His surgical knowledge was limited, but his understanding of contagious diseases was ahead of his time. Avicenna described diseases spreading through water, soil, and air, tiptoeing dangerously close to germ theory. He even recommended quarantine during outbreaks, centuries before it became common practice. In Europe, the Canon of Medicine was translated into Latin in the 12th century and used as a university textbook until the 1600s. It was revered not just for its content, but for its clarity. To European physicians wading through mysticism and superstition, Avicenna's book was like medical scripture. Of course, he wasn't perfect. He still believed in astrology, temperaments, and that gold could be used medicinally. But in an age where bleeding, chanting, and guesswork were common, Avicenna offered something precious: order, logic, and a systematic way to learn from patients. In short, he didn't banish the myths, but he brought medicine out of the fog and onto a path of critical thinking. For that alone, Ibn Sina earned his place in the Hall of Medical Giants. If Hippocrates was the father of medicine, Galen was its long-reigning emperor. Born in 129 CE in the Roman Empire, Galen became the most influential medical thinker of the ancient world. So influential, in fact, that his errors shaped medicine for over a millennium. Galen was brilliant, yes, but he was also spectacularly wrong in ways that haunted Western medicine deep into the Renaissance. Galen believed in the four humours, but he took the theory to theatrical new heights. He insisted that each organ had a primary humour, that diseases were caused by humoral imbalances, and that restoring equilibrium required precise treatments like bloodletting, purging, or diet manipulation. His anatomical writings were considered gospel, but here's the twist. He never dissected a human body. Roman law forbade it, so Galen relied on animal dissection, mostly monkeys and pigs. The result? A cascade of flawed assumptions. He believed the liver produced blood, which then travelled to the rest of the body through invisible pores in the heart. He thought the brain cooled the blood like a radiator, and that the heart didn't circulate blood. It just absorbed and distributed it. These were not small mistakes. They became foundational doctrines for 1,400 years. Despite this, Galen wasn't just a blind follower of dogma. He emphasized empirical observation, conducted experiments, and even used logical deduction in diagnosis. He was a prolific writer, producing hundreds of texts that combined medicine, philosophy, and anatomy. His work was so voluminous and authoritative that later scholars dared not challenge him. To do so was almost heresy. In the Islamic world, Galen's texts were translated into Arabic and later into Latin, becoming standard curriculum in medieval European universities. But with reverence came stagnation. For centuries, medical students learned how to confirm Galen, not how to question him. Dissecting a human corpse and finding inconsistencies? Must be the corpse that's wrong, not Galen. It wasn't until the Renaissance and figures like Andreas Vesalius that Galen's anatomical errors were finally debunked through direct human dissection. When blood was discovered to circulate, not just seep, medicine was finally unshackled from his grip. Galen's legacy is a paradox, a brilliant thinker whose devotion to logic and observation inspired generations, yet whose mistakes delayed key medical breakthroughs for centuries. In the end, he reminds us that knowledge must always be questioned, even when it comes from a genius with a scalpel. In the West, ancient medicine leaned heavily on bodily fluids and bloodletting. But in the East, particularly in ancient China, medicine took an entirely different route, one based on invisible energy, flowing rivers of life force, and carefully placed needles. Enter acupuncture, a practice that's over 2,000 years old and still used today, despite its mysterious and sometimes misunderstood origins. At the heart of acupuncture is the concept of qi, pronounced qi, the life force or energy that flows through the body along invisible channels called meridians. Illness, according to ancient Chinese belief, occurs when qi is blocked, imbalanced, or weakened. The cure? Restore the proper flow, and that's where acupuncture comes in. By inserting thin needles at specific points on the body, practitioners aim to redirect and harmonize qi, unblocking the body's internal traffic jams. The earliest references to acupuncture appear in texts like the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, written around the 2nd century BCE. This foundational work described meridians, acupuncture points, and how different organs corresponded with elements like fire, earth, and water. It wasn't based on anatomy as we know it. There were no blood vessels or nerves in these meridians. Instead, it was a system rooted in balance, harmony, and observation of nature. Despite the mystical language, acupuncture did produce observable effects. It could reduce pain, induce relaxation, and, in some cases, improve recovery, likely due to the body's own endorphin release and nervous system responses. In ancient times, these effects were interpreted as evidence that qi had been restored. Acupuncture wasn't used alone. It was part of a larger framework of traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, which included herbal remedies, dietary regulation, cupping therapy, and moxibustion, burning herbs near the skin. The goal was always the same: to restore internal balance and sync the body with the natural world. Western medicine remained skeptical for centuries, especially because acupuncture's anatomical claims didn't match scientific models. But in the modern era, studies have shown that while meridians may not exist physically, acupuncture can influence the nervous system, reduce chronic pain, and even help with nausea or migraines. It's not magic, it's biology, reframed. For all the bizarre rituals, dangerous substances, and downright mythical theories that shaped ancient medicine, not everything was a shot in the dark. In fact, some ancient treatments, born from careful observation, experimentation, or pure necessity, were surprisingly effective. And in a few cases, modern science has circled all the way back to say, they were on to something. Let's start with honey. Used in ancient Egypt, Greece and China as a wound dressing, honey was prized for its sweetness and its antibacterial properties. Today we know that honey contains enzymes that produce hydrogen peroxide, making it effective against certain bacteria. It also keeps wounds moist and forms a protective barrier. Modern medicine now uses medical-grade honey for burns and ulcers, proving that not all sticky cures are superstition. Ancient Indian physicians, particularly those practicing Ayurveda, promoted the use of turmeric for inflammation and digestion. Modern studies have confirmed that curcumin, the active compound in turmeric, has anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. It doesn't cure everything as once claimed, but it's not just spice cabinet snake oil either. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest known Egyptian medical texts, included treatments for constipation, parasites, and even depression. Some recipes involved castor oil, garlic, and willow bark, the last of which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. That's right. Long before Bayer marketed little white pills, ancient Egyptians were chewing on nature's painkiller. In China, herbalists used ma huang, ephedra, to treat asthma and congestion. Its active ingredient, ephedrine, was later isolated and used in modern decongestants and stimulants, until it was banned in many countries due to misuse. Still, it showed that even without a molecular understanding, ancient physicians could identify potent compounds through trial and error. The Greeks, particularly Hippocrates, emphasized diet and lifestyle as medicine. "Let food be thy medicine," he supposedly said. And while modern nutrition science is far more complex, the core idea that health begins with what we consume remains profoundly true. Even practices like quarantine, used in ancient Persia and recommended by Avicenna, showed early awareness of disease transmission long before germ theory existed. Imagine working a full month, harvesting crops, building temples or copying texts, and instead of coins or digital deposits, you're paid in sacks of barley. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia, where economics ran not on cash but on grain. This wasn't a barter system. It was a remarkably organized, centrally controlled economic structure, with temples and palaces acting as proto-bureaucracies, and in many ways, early banks. In places like Uruk and Lagash, salaries were calculated based on social status, profession, and productivity. A high-ranking temple official might receive hundreds of litres of grain per month, while a labourer received enough for subsistence. Alongside barley, wages could also be paid in beer, oil, wool, or even bread. These items weren't randomly chosen. They were commodities with stable value and constant demand. Think of them as the gold standards of Mesopotamian daily life. But how did anyone keep track of all this grain flowing through the economy? Enter the mighty clay tablet. Covered in cuneiform script, these early accounting records listed workers' names, tasks, rations, and even tax payments. The scribes, essentially the accountants of their day, used standardized measures and symbols. One tablet might read, 2 workers, 5 days, 3 litres of barley per day. Multiplied over thousands of labourers, you can imagine the scale of coordination required. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were economic engines. They controlled vast tracts of land, employed thousands, and stored food supplies for redistribution. Workers toiled in temple fields, herded temple livestock, and repaired temple walls, all in exchange for rations. And because the temple issued those rations, it controlled both labour and livelihood. The state and religion were fused in economic policy. There was even a system of credit and interest. Need extra grain to survive the winter? Borrow from the temple, with interest, often calculated in kind. Can't pay it back? You risked debt slavery or the loss of your land. The earliest versions of usury laws and debt forgiveness emerged in this period. Some kings, recognizing the danger of runaway debt, periodically erased obligations in grand gestures of economic reset, what we might call a jubilee. If Mesopotamia ran on barley, ancient Egypt ran on the Nile and its grain. The river wasn't just a water source, it was the economic backbone of the entire civilization. Each year, the Nile's flood deposited fertile silt along its banks, enabling large-scale agriculture. And from this reliable rhythm came one of history's most centralized and state-controlled economies. Egypt didn't use coins until the very end of the pharaonic period. For most of its history, it functioned on a redistribution economy. Farmers paid a portion of their harvest, usually grain, as tax to the state. That grain was then stored in massive state granaries, some of which could hold enough to feed entire cities. These granaries acted as economic buffers, especially in times of famine, drought, or political instability. Instead of private banking, Egypt's economy flowed through the pharaoh and his bureaucracy. The vizier oversaw economic planning, with scribes dispatched across the kingdom to assess crop yields and collect taxes. Everything was documented in fine detail, from field sizes to weather conditions. If a farmer failed to meet his quota, he might be flogged or fined. The records didn't lie. Grain wasn't just food, it was currency. Workers who helped build temples or pyramids weren't paid in gold but in rations, loaves of bread, beer, and onions. A labourer's daily wage might include 5 loaves and 2 jugs of beer, considered both sustenance and compensation. Even craftsmen and priests were compensated in kind, with higher rations according to rank. The state also set prices. There are surviving lists showing the relative values of goods. How many sacks of grain for a goat? How many loaves of bread for a pair of sandals? This wasn't a free market, but a controlled pricing system designed to ensure order in trade and stability in society. Wealth was measured less in metal and more in land and grain. Nobles with large estates could accumulate enormous power, but the pharaoh always had final claim. During times of scarcity, the state would reopen the granaries, both as a tool of mercy and as a way to reassert authority. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Greeks introduced something that would forever reshape economic history: coins. Real, stamped metal currency, used not just for taxes or temples, but for daily transactions in bustling markets. This wasn't just a technological innovation, it was a psychological one. It created trust in value, backed not by grain or gods, but by a shared idea of worth hammered into silver and bronze. The earliest Greek coins emerged around the 7th century BCE in Lydia, but it was the city-states of mainland Greece, like Athens, Corinth, and Aegina, that developed monetary economies. Athens, for instance, minted the famous owl tetradrachms, made of pure silver mined from the Laurian mines in Attica. These coins weren't just currency, they were propaganda. The owl, symbolizing wisdom and Athena, reminded users of where the coin came from and who guaranteed its value. Coins enabled rapid trade and taxation. Instead of hauling grain or livestock, merchants could pay port fees or soldiers with a handful of coins. And crucially, coins allowed for standardized value. This was especially important in pan-Hellenic trade networks, where dozens of city-states with different economies still needed to conduct business. A coin with a recognizable stamp became a passport of trust. But Greek economics wasn't just about shiny coins and markets. Wealth inequality was a chronic issue. In many city-states, including Athens, land was concentrated in the hands of a few, while indebted farmers struggled to survive. That's why reformers like Solon famously cancelled debts and banned debt slavery, moves that weren't just humanitarian, but essential for social stability. There were also early experiments in price control and rationing. In times of war or famine, some polis imposed limits on bread prices or restricted grain exports. The state wasn't afraid to step in when the market turned cruel. And it wasn't just the government using economics strategically. Temples were major economic players too. Sanctuaries like Delphi or Delos operated as financial centres, holding treasuries, lending money, and even issuing receipts. Religion and economy were entwined, just with more marble. Greek philosophy also influenced economic thought. Plato and Aristotle wrote about the dangers of usury, the morality of profit, and the ideal balance between self-sufficiency and commerce. Economics for them wasn't just math, it was ethics. In Greece, the coin was born. But so was the debate. How do you manage wealth, power, and fairness in a world where money now moves faster than grain? By the time Rome rose to power, the ancient economy had entered a new phase, imperial scale. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, oversaw vast territories stretching from Britain to Egypt. With this expansion came an enormous challenge: how to fund the machine that kept legions marching, aqueducts flowing, and emperors firmly in power. At the heart of Rome's economic engine was taxation. Unlike earlier civilizations where payments were made in grain or goods, Rome relied heavily on coinage, especially after the silver denarius became the standard. Citizens paid taxes in coins, while provinces paid tribute, often collected in precious metals or bulk commodities. And if you were conquered, you paid for the privilege of losing. Tax collection, however, wasn't always neat. Rome often used a system called tax farming. Wealthy private individuals, known as publicani, would pay the state up front for the right to collect taxes in a region. Whatever they gathered beyond that sum was their profit. Unsurprisingly, this led to abuse and extortion, especially in distant provinces where oversight was weak. Cicero himself railed against corrupt tax farmers in his speeches. The empire also maintained a military payroll that dwarfed anything in the ancient world. Soldiers were paid in coins and land grants, a powerful incentive for loyalty. The state minted millions of coins annually, drawing silver from mines in Spain and gold from Dacia. But maintaining this system was expensive. When revenues dipped, emperors often debased the currency, reducing silver content to stretch the supply. This practice, while temporarily effective, led to inflation and public distrust. Rome's economy wasn't all taxes and war. There was a vibrant market economy, especially in urban centres. Markets were filled with imported luxuries: silk from China, pepper from India, glassware from Egypt. Trade was facilitated by Roman roads, ports, and a relatively safe Mediterranean dubbed Mare Nostrum, our sea. State-controlled grain doles in cities like Rome provided free or subsidized bread to thousands, keeping the poor fed and politically quiet. Wealth inequality, however, was stark. The elite senatorial class owned vast latifundia, or plantations, worked by slaves. Small farmers were often driven into debt or absorbed by larger estates. Economic mobility was limited, and prosperity flowed upward. Rome showed the world what a monetized, centralized economy could look like, but it also revealed the cracks: inflation, exploitation, and a growing gap between the taxed and the taxing. Sound familiar? Some problems, it seems, are timeless. As the Roman Empire marched into the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, its economy began to wobble, then crack. Trade networks strained, military costs ballooned, and worst of all, confidence in the imperial currency collapsed. The story of late Roman economics is a cautionary tale of what happens when a government tries to fix a financial crisis by tampering with its own money. The early silver denarius, once the bedrock of Roman commerce, had steadily lost value. In a desperate attempt to pay soldiers and public officials, emperors began to debase the coinage, diluting the silver content with cheaper metals like copper and lead. A coin that once held real value became little more than a metal token. Trust eroded, prices rose, and suddenly inflation wasn't just a word, it was daily reality. By the time of Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century, inflation was spiralling. Bread that once cost 1 coin could now cost 100. In response, Diocletian issued the infamous edict on maximum prices in 301 CE. This massive decree attempted to fix prices on everything from wheat to labour to lion meat. It even set maximum wages for professions. Violation of the edict could mean death. Sounds decisive, but it failed spectacularly. Sellers refused to part with goods at government-mandated prices, the black market exploded, and enforcement became nearly impossible. The edict faded into irrelevance, a monument to how command economics can't override supply and demand. To stabilize the chaos, Diocletian and later Constantine attempted monetary reform. Diocletian introduced new coins like the aureus, and Constantine launched the solidus, a gold coin that would actually endure for centuries as a stable currency. But for everyday people, especially in the provinces, access to stable coinage remained limited. Most still relied on barter or hoarded older coins with real silver content. Meanwhile, the empire's economy became more autarkic, self-contained. Large estates grew their own food, crafted their own tools, and distanced themselves from the volatile market. This shift marked the beginning of the manorial economy that would dominate the Middle Ages. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the eastern half, Byzantium, kept the imperial torch burning, both politically and economically. Centered in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire didn't just survive for another 1,000 years. It preserved and refined Roman economic systems. But it walked a constant tightrope between control and collapse, micromanagement and market forces. At the heart of Byzantine stability was the solidus, a gold coin introduced by Constantine. Remarkably, it maintained its weight and purity for over 700 years. Known in Western Europe as the bezant, the solidus became the most trusted international currency of its time. Merchants in Baghdad, Venice, and even China accepted it. In a world riddled with debased currencies, Byzantium's gold was pure and its reputation priceless. But that didn't mean the economy ran on laissez-faire principles. Quite the opposite. The Byzantine state was famously interventionist. It set official prices for bread, wine, oil, and other staples in Constantinople. The annona system, inherited from Rome, ensured that grain shipments from Egypt and other provinces fed the capital regularly, free of market volatility. This was a political necessity. If bread disappeared or prices spiked, riots followed. The people of Constantinople were famously not shy about their dissatisfaction. The empire also maintained a highly sophisticated bureaucracy, including tax officials, grain inspectors, and urban price controllers. Farmers paid taxes partly in produce and partly in cash, while soldiers and bureaucrats were paid in gold, ensuring both loyalty and liquidity. But the Byzantine economy was also deeply stratified. Wealth concentrated in powerful landowning families, many of whom received tax exemptions. The result? A shrinking tax base and growing burden on smallholders and peasants. Some emperors, like Basil the Comte, cracked down on aristocratic privilege to protect the treasury. Others, less disciplined, handed out land grants and exemptions like candy, destabilizing the system in the long run. Trade flourished, especially in luxury goods, silks, spices, and religious icons. The state even tried to control who could produce and sell certain items. Guilds were tightly regulated. Silk, for example, was originally a state monopoly. The empire feared that losing control of it meant losing control of both wealth and diplomacy. While the Mediterranean world was calculating taxes in denarii and hoarding solidi, ancient China was quietly developing one of the most sophisticated and long-lasting economic systems in human history. Centered around agriculture, particularly rice and millet, China's economy also birthed radical innovations: standardized coinage, bureaucratic taxation, and even the world's first paper money. In early dynasties like the Zhou and Qin, land ownership was tied directly to tax obligations. Farmers paid their dues in grain or labour, either to the state or local lords. But as China unified under the Han Dynasty, the state expanded control over trade, resource extraction, and money. Taxes were streamlined into three forms: land tax, a share of your harvest; labour tax, days spent working on public projects; and tribute tax, in kind or cash. This system supported an enormous bureaucracy, one staffed by educated officials chosen via imperial examinations, a meritocratic concept far ahead of its time. Currency came early. The Ban Liang coin, a round copper piece with a square hole, was one of the first standardized currencies issued under the Qin dynasty. It wasn't just money, it was a symbol of unity. Later dynasties like the Tang and Song improved the system further, using bronze and later iron coins, which were strung together in hundreds to make large purchases. But innovation didn't stop at metal. During the Song dynasty, as trade exploded and merchants found hauling coins cumbersome, China invented something revolutionary: paper money. Called jiaozi, these notes were initially issued by private merchants and later adopted by the state. By the 11th century, government-issued paper currency was in full circulation, nearly 1,000 years before Europe caught up. The state kept a tight grip on salt, iron and tea, often monopolizing production and controlling prices. Trade was both local and international. China's Silk Road linked it to Persia and Rome, while maritime trade reached as far as Africa. Despite innovations, China wasn't immune to inflation or economic imbalance. Overproduction of paper money under the Yuan dynasty eventually led to currency devaluation and public distrust. Still, the foundational principles of land-based taxation, bureaucratic management, and currency control gave China an economic continuity the West could only envy. In ancient India, economics took a uniquely spiritual turn. While other civilizations funneled wealth through kings or emperors, India's wealth often flowed through temples. These were not just houses of worship, they were financial institutions, landowners, employers, and even local banks. At the same time, bustling urban centres and far-flung trade routes were energized by merchant guilds, some of which functioned with near-sovereign independence. Temples in regions like Tamil Nadu or Karnataka amassed wealth through donations of gold, land, and livestock. A king or noble might donate an entire village to a temple, complete with its people, fields, and tax rights. These temples then reinvested. They lent grain, leased land, employed artisans, and managed irrigation. Inscriptions reveal loans made with interest, repaid in kind or coin. In effect, the priestly elite became fiscal managers, blending ritual with revenue. India's economy was also deeply entwined with religious festivals and pilgrimages. Towns like Varanasi or Madurai drew massive crowds during holy days, sparking surges in local trade. Vendors, performers, farmers and financiers all benefited. For many pilgrims, the spiritual journey doubled as an economic one. Parallel to the temples were the merchant guilds known as shreni. These were tightly organised professional associations, blacksmiths, weavers, spice traders, each regulating prices, quality and wages. Some even had their own codes of conduct and internal courts. More impressively, certain guilds accumulated enough capital to lend money to kings, fund temple construction, or send trading caravans across borders. Think of them as early corporations, self-regulating, self-financing, and deeply influential. India also maintained robust long-distance trade networks. Through ports like Lothal, Tamralipta, and Bharuch, goods like spices, gemstones, ivory, and textiles travelled to Persia, Rome, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Indian merchants used a variety of currencies: punch-marked silver coins, copper tokens, and even cowrie shells in certain regions. But economic life wasn't all opulence. The caste system rigidly dictated economic roles, limiting upward mobility. A potter's son became a potter, a merchant's son a merchant. While some flexibility existed in practice, institutional change was rare. As we look across the ancient world, from Mesopotamian barley wages to Byzantine price controls, one thing becomes clear: human economies have always been about more than money. They are systems of trust, power, belief, and survival. And though they varied in scale and sophistication, ancient economies confronted many of the same problems we face today: debt crises, inflation, inequality, and resource distribution. Debt, for instance, was a recurring theme. In Mesopotamia, debt could lead to enslavement, but kings often forgave debts in grand amnesties. In Athens, farmers burdened by debt were rescued by Solon's reforms. In Rome, over-indebtedness fueled civil unrest and populist uprisings. Again and again, ancient societies had to confront a simple truth. When too much wealth accumulates at the top, the system cracks. Inequality wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Most wealth, whether land, grain, or coin, was concentrated in the hands of a few. Empires like Rome or India saw small farmers slowly crushed under taxes and competition from elite landowners. The result? Widening social divides, political instability, and eventual decline. Sound familiar? Inflation was another universal plague. Rome's currency collapse in the 3rd century mirrors modern fears about money printing. The Byzantines tried to hold the line with the solidus, while China swung between innovation and overreach with paper money. These civilizations show us that trust in currency is fragile, and once lost, difficult to restore. Yet there's also a lesson in resilience. Ancient economies were incredibly adaptive. When coinage failed, people returned to barter. When the market collapsed, communities leaned on temples or guilds. When central control wavered, local systems filled the gap. The absence of modern banks didn't mean chaos, it meant creativity. Another takeaway? Economics was always social. It wasn't just about markets and production, but rituals, festivals, kinship networks, and cosmic order. A temple's vault, a farmer's field, and a king's tax collector were all tied together in a shared worldview about how wealth should move and who should control it. In the end, the ancients didn't solve economic inequality or invent a perfect system, but they understood what we sometimes forget, that economies are human ecosystems, and like all ecosystems, they flourish only when balance is maintained. Ignore that balance, and even the strongest empire can fall, grain by grain, coin by coin. Imagine you've travelled for days, maybe even weeks, through the dusty hills and olive groves of ancient Greece. You're not here for sightseeing or worship in the usual sense. You're here because you're desperate. Your joints ache, your eyesight is fading, or perhaps something more mysterious troubles you, something the village doctors can't explain. And so, you've come to the sanctuary of Asclepios at Epidaurus. Not a hospital, not a clinic, but a divine healing complex nestled in the hills of the Peloponnese, where medicine and miracles meet. As you approach the sanctuary, the first thing you see isn't a grand temple, but a series of orderly structures, baths, gymnasiums, a stadium, even a massive theatre. You wonder, is this really a place of healing? But then you cross the boundary into sacred ground, where normal rules no longer apply. The air smells of burnt offerings and medicinal herbs. Pilgrims whisper prayers. Sacred dogs roam freely. And everywhere, yes, everywhere, there are snakes. Non-venomous, of course, but still unsettling. These are the sacred animals of Asclepios, believed to carry his healing power. A priest, or therapeutes, meets you and begins a ritual purification. You wash in sacred waters. You fast. You leave offerings, perhaps a coin, a fruit, or a small clay replica of the body part that needs healing. Then you're shown to the abaton, the dormitory where the real miracle is said to happen. You will sleep there tonight, in hopes of receiving a divine dream. Asclepios himself may visit you in your sleep, touching your body with his staff, whispering cures, or sending signs. There's no anesthesia, no scalpels, just faith, ceremony, and a deeply ingrained belief that dreams are more than illusions. They are divine messages. For the ancient Greeks, healing wasn't just a physical process. It was spiritual, psychological, and symbolic. And Epidaurus? It was the ultimate destination for anyone seeking not just a cure, but transformation. This is not a place you leave unchanged. For many, it was the last hope. For others, it was the only place where medicine met meaning, and sickness found something more than science could offer. Before Epidaurus became the ultimate healing destination, there was the myth, the divine figure behind the sanctuary, Asclepios. To understand the sanctuary, you must understand the god. Asclepios wasn't just another Olympian with a penchant for lightning or war. He was different. He healed, and that made him both revered and at times feared. According to legend, Asclepios was the son of Apollo. Yes, that Apollo, god of music, prophecy, and yes, medicine, and a mortal woman named Coronis. The story doesn't begin happily. Coronis, while pregnant, was unfaithful. Apollo, enraged and betrayed, had her killed, but not before saving the unborn child from her funeral pyre. That child was Asclepios, delivered by divine hands, bathed in fire and fate. From birth, Asclepios was destined for healing. Apollo entrusted him to the wise centaur Chiron, who taught him everything: surgery, herbology, anatomy, even the mystical arts of dream interpretation and incantations. But Asclepios didn't stop there. His talents surpassed mere teaching. He became so skilled he could cure any illness. Some say he even learned how to bring the dead back to life. That was a problem. The gods don't like balance being disturbed. Death, after all, was the realm of Hades, and if humans no longer died, what chaos would that unleash? Zeus, keeper of cosmic order, struck Asclepios down with a thunderbolt. Just like that, the healer was gone. But he didn't vanish from memory. The people mourned, honoured, and then deified him. Over time, Asclepios transformed from a mythic doctor to a full-fledged god, worshipped not in fear, but in hope. His emblem, a staff with a single snake coiled around it, remains the symbol of medicine to this day. And in sanctuaries across the Greek world, but most famously at Epidaurus, people gathered to seek his blessing. Unlike other gods who demanded blood or gold, Asclepios asked only for faith, and maybe a small terracotta limb or a whispered prayer beneath the stars. In him, the Greeks found not just divine power, but a model for what healing could be: compassionate, wise, and strangely personal. Epidaurus wasn't just a place to cure disease, it was a place to connect with something older, deeper, and yes, perhaps even divine. At the heart of the sanctuary of Asclepios was a ritual unlike anything in modern medicine: incubation, or enkoimesis in Greek. No scalpels, no pills, no diagnosis from a man in a white coat. Instead, patients laid themselves down to sleep in the abaton, a sacred dormitory, with one goal: to dream. Because here, dreams were prescriptions, and Asclepios, the divine physician who made house calls while you slept. Before entering the abaton, every visitor underwent purification. This wasn't just for hygiene, it was to cleanse the soul. Fasting, bathing, abstaining from certain behaviors, and performing ritual sacrifices were required. Only when the body and spirit were deemed worthy could the patient lie beneath the temple roof, surrounded by quiet stone columns and flickering oil lamps. Some patients brought small offerings, like clay replicas of their aching limbs or afflicted organs. Others arrived with only hope. Then came the night. The abaton was filled with others, strangers all hoping to receive a message from the god. Sacred snakes slithered freely across the floor, considered holy messengers of Asclepios. Some accounts say these snakes even crawled across the bodies of the sick, transferring healing energy. It might sound horrifying now, but to an ancient Greek, this was a sign that Asclepios had noticed you. The dream itself was the crux of the treatment. Those fortunate enough to receive one often described it as vivid, symbolic, and strangely reassuring. Asclepios might appear in human form, or as a radiant presence. He might speak clearly, or act out a healing in a kind of divine performance. One dream might show the god performing surgery. Another might be more cryptic: a walk through a garden, a sudden transformation, a snake coiling around the affected body part. In the morning, the patient would report the dream to a temple priest, trained not in anatomy, but in dream interpretation. The priest would then offer guidance, perhaps prescribing a further ritual, a specific diet, or a series of acts to perform in honor of the god. Did it always work? Hard to say. But for the ancient Greeks, healing wasn't just physical. It was emotional, symbolic, and profoundly spiritual. They didn't expect miracles every time, but they believed that through dreams, the veil between mortal and divine could thin. And sometimes, in the quiet of the Abaton, healing came not through medicine, but through meaning. Epidaros wasn't just sacred, it was stunning. The architecture of the sanctuary wasn't accidental or ornamental, it was part of the treatment. Everything from the columns to the pathways was designed to soothe the soul and elevate the mind. If you're picturing a dark monastic space, think again. Epidaros was open, orderly, sunlit, a landscape where harmony itself seemed to dwell. At the centre of it all was the temple of Asclepios, the god's official residence. Built in the Doric style, it stood tall and proud, surrounded by sculpted friezes that told stories of healing and sacrifice. A massive statue of Asclepios, reportedly made of gold and ivory, once stood inside, bearded, calm, and holding his snake-wrapped staff. Worshippers would enter the temple to make offerings and prayers, hoping to attract the god's favour before undergoing incubation. Next to the temple lay the Tholos, a circular building whose exact purpose remains a mystery. But this wasn't just a pretty ruin. Ancient writers describe intricate underground passages and clever acoustics. Some believe it functioned as part of the dream incubation ritual, perhaps a place where sacred snakes were kept, or where initiates underwent secret rites. It added a layer of mystery to an already mystical experience. Then there was the Abaton, the sleeping hall. Long and columned, its simple design belied its sacred power. This was where you lay in hope of a dream, shoulder to shoulder with fellow pilgrims. Though it may seem humble today, the psychological effect was profound. Lying under the stars, surrounded by sacred architecture, believing you were close to the divine, it was enough to shift the soul, if not the body. But Epidaros was more than its sacred core. There were baths, gymnasiums, stowers for walking and contemplation, and even a theatre, the largest of its kind, seating over 13,000. Why a theatre in a healing sanctuary? Because mental stimulation, laughter, and storytelling were part of the cure. Greeks understood that healing wasn't just about herbs and prayers. It was about environment, mood, and emotion. Even aesthetics were therapeutic. Let's clear something up. Epidaros wasn't all dreams and divine visions. While enkoimesis was the central ritual, the sanctuary offered a surprisingly diverse range of physical treatments that might look oddly familiar to modern wellness centres. The ancients didn't separate the mystical from the practical. They combined them into a healing system that was ritualistic, symbolic, and surprisingly hands-on. Take, for example, therapeutic baths. Water was considered sacred, a purifier not just for the body, but for the soul. Patients would bathe in spring-fed pools, often before rituals, as a form of cleansing. These weren't casual dips. They were part of the preparatory phase of healing. The Greeks believed that washing the body opened it to divine influence. It was step one in resetting the self. Then there was dietary regulation. The priests at Epidaros often prescribed specific diets based on one's condition. Light foods, wine diluted with water, fasting. This wasn't about calorie counting. It was about balance. Ancient Greek medicine, influenced by Hippocratic thought, saw disease as imbalance and food as a tool to restore harmony. Ritual fasting before sleep in the Abaton was thought to make the dream state more potent and vivid. Physical activity was also encouraged. Patients walked in the colonnades, exercised in the gymnasia, and attended performances in the theatre. Emotional release, movement, and even communal laughter were seen as integral to healing. They didn't have a word for mental health, but they understood that the mind mattered. And what better therapy than a well-timed Greek tragedy followed by a hearty laugh? And yes, there were snakes. Sacred to Asclepios, they symbolized renewal, wisdom, and the cyclical nature of life. Non-venomous serpents slithered through the temple and dormitory spaces. Their touch during sleep was believed to be a healing sign. If a snake approached you in the Abaton, the gods were listening. Terrifying. Maybe. but to the ancients, it was sacred reassurance. Even minor surgeries and wound care were performed. Though rudimentary by today's standards, they had tools, salves made from honey and herbs, and even basic antiseptic knowledge. Combined with prayer and ritual, these treatments were holistic in the truest sense. Epidaurus welcomed everyone. Unlike some ancient temples where only elites passed through marble gates, the sanctuary of Asclepios was a beacon to all: farmers, merchants, nobles, slaves. Sickness didn't discriminate, and neither, it seemed, did the god of healing. That inclusivity made Epidaurus not just a place of worship, but a living archive of human suffering and hope. Patients arrived from all corners of the Greek world and beyond, some limping, some blind, some carried in on makeshift stretchers by friends or family. Others came for chronic illnesses, mental torments, infertility, or unexplained maladies that baffled local physicians. If regular cures had failed, you came here. If no cure had been tried, you came anyway. And it wasn't just the sick who journeyed to Epidaurus. Often, entire families would make the pilgrimage. Some brought their ill children. Others accompanied elderly relatives, hoping for one last chance at relief. In this way, the sanctuary became a bustling mosaic of human stories, each one longing for a divine reply. We know about these people not just from archaeological remains, but from the inscriptions they left behind. On marble slabs near the Abaton, dozens of testimonies were carved in stone. Patient case studies, if you will. One recounts how a man with a paralyzed arm dreamed of Asclepios massaging it, and awoke cured. Another tells of a blind woman who, after dreaming of the god touching her eyes, regained her vision by morning. Some stories are dramatic, even theatrical. Others are humble and short, but all of them pulse with the same theme: gratitude. These inscriptions served a purpose beyond record-keeping. They were public proof, evidence of miracles meant to inspire faith and attract future pilgrims. Imagine walking into the sanctuary, frightened and sick, and reading the carved story of someone just like you who walked out healed. Hope, after all, is contagious. But not everyone was cured. For every miracle etched in stone, there were surely many unrecorded disappointments. And yet, even in failure, patients often left feeling transformed. Perhaps it was the sense of community, the ritual process, or the sheer beauty of the place. Perhaps it was simply being seen, not as a lost cause, but as someone worthy of divine attention. Behind the tranquil rituals and marble columns of Epidaurus was a small army of people who kept the sacred machinery of healing running. This wasn't a free-for-all where pilgrims showed up and hoped for magic. There was a structure, an ancient, theocratic healthcare system, run by those who knew the rituals, interpreted dreams, and fed the snakes. At the top of this system were the priests of Asclepios, sometimes called therapeutai, literally attendants or servants of the god. These weren't priests in the modern sense. They acted as caretakers of both the temple and its patients. Part spiritual guides, part psychologists, part ritual technicians, they were trained in the precise ceremonies and dream interpretations that formed the sanctuary's core. When a patient awoke from an incubation sleep, it was these priests who listened to their dreams and translated divine symbolism into actionable steps. But not everything was left to divine whispers. The sanctuary also employed physicians, influenced by Hippocratic and Galenic methods. Some were probably hybrids, trained in both practical medicine and sacred rites. They recommended diets, administered salves and massages, and even performed minor surgeries. These healers understood that while divine power could be invoked, practical measures couldn't be ignored. Then came the dream interpreters, specialized priests whose sole purpose was decoding the cryptic nocturnal messages from Asclepios. If you dreamt of snakes wrapping around your neck, or of a god performing surgery with a golden blade, they'd determine what it meant. A change in behavior, a new offering, a ritual to repeat. Their interpretations could be gentle or alarming, but always carried weight. Support staff also played a role. Temple attendants cleaned the dormitories, managed the sacred animals, maintained the grounds, and guided newcomers through the process. Sacred musicians provided calming melodies in the background, especially during ceremonies. Even scribes were essential. They carved the miracle testimonies into stone, documenting the divine resume of Asclepios, one healing at a time. These people weren't just functionaries. They were custodians of belief, carefully preserving the delicate balance between hope and expectation. At Epidaurus, healing didn't just come from the god. It came through human hands acting in sacred service. And for thousands of pilgrims, that structure gave the experience legitimacy. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography, a divine dance between gods, dreams, and very human helpers. It might seem strange to modern eyes, but one of the most iconic buildings at Epidaurus wasn't a temple or a hospital. It was a theatre, a massive one. Carved into the hillside, the theatre of Epidaurus could seat over 13,000 spectators, and is still praised today for its flawless acoustics and symmetry. But what was a theatre doing in a sanctuary of healing? For the ancient Greeks, the answer was obvious. Drama was therapy. Attending a performance wasn't just about entertainment. It was a ritual, a cleansing of the soul, a process they called catharsis. The emotions evoked by Greek tragedies and comedies, grief, joy, anger, laughter, weren't distractions from illness. They were treatments. Watching a play about fate and suffering might help a grieving mother release her sorrow. A comedic performance could break the isolation of someone paralyzed by fear. This was group therapy, ancient style. The theatre also connected patients to the mythic worldview that underpinned the sanctuary. Many of the plays performed dealt with themes of divine justice, human error, healing, and redemption. Figures like Orestes, Electra, or even Asclepios himself might appear on stage. Their stories weren't just entertainment. They were mirrors, showing the audience how even gods and heroes struggled with pain, loss, and rebirth. More than that, the theatre served a social function. Pilgrims came from all over the Mediterranean, each with their own dialects, traditions, and gods. In the theatre, they sat side by side, laughed together, cried together. That shared emotional experience helped break down barriers. You were no longer a stranger with an illness. You were part of a healing community. Scholars believe performances at Epidaurus were carefully timed to coincide with major religious festivals for Asclepios. After sacrifices, rituals, and dream incubation, patients could attend the theatre and reflect on what they had experienced. It was the final act of a multi-day therapeutic journey, one that involved the body, the spirit, and now, the emotions. When you walk through the ruins of Epidaurus today, it's hard not to feel the weight of history pressing softly against the silence. The columns may be broken, the statues weathered, but the spirit of the sanctuary still lingers in the air. And what it represents is something the modern world is just beginning to remember, that healing is more than a prescription. It's an experience. For centuries, the sanctuary of Asclepios thrived as the premier healing centre of the ancient world. Other Asclepieia existed, in places like Kos and Pergamon, but Epidaurus was the heart. Even the Romans, practical as they were, respected its power. The sanctuary remained active until the rise of Christianity, when pagan temples were shuttered or repurposed. The sacred snakes vanished. The dream halls went quiet. And Asclepios, once a god, was demoted to myth. But his legacy didn't die. The symbol of Asclepios' staff, coiled with a single serpent, still endures as the global emblem of medicine. The idea of holistic treatment, of addressing the mind, body, and spirit, echoes through modern wellness movements, psychology, and even palliative care. Epidaurus anticipated things we now recognize: the role of belief in recovery, the importance of environment, and the healing power of human connection. And let's not ignore what the sanctuary teaches us about the power of ritual. The fasting, the bathing, the prayers, the storytelling, all created a structure in which suffering had meaning. It wasn't random, it was part of a narrative. For many pilgrims, that alone was transformative. Even today, patients often report better outcomes when they feel seen, heard, and guided through a journey, not just treated as a symptom on a clipboard. Epidaurus also reminds us of something deeply human, the need to believe. Whether in gods or in science, in dreams or in data, people will always seek a story that helps them make sense of illness and health. That's not superstition, that's survival. So, as we stand among the sunlit ruins, we're left with more than admiration for ancient architecture. We're left with a question. What if healing was sacred again? What if hospitals offered not just treatment, but meaning? What if medicine remembered the wisdom of the past? At Epidaurus, they didn't just cure bodies, they restored hope. And sometimes that was the greatest miracle of all.